All right, great. Welcome, everyone. If you are new to this portion of the training, this is part two. We have just completed part one of special education for children in the child welfare system. I am Mary-Beth Landy, the senior trainer of the training, recruitment, and support specialist for the special education surrogate parents at the Federation for Children with Special Needs in Boston. I have served as a family advocate for over 17 years, specializing in mental health and trauma in children and adolescents. My experience of trauma is both learned and lived by parenting two daughters adopted through the child welfare system in Massachusetts who have struggled with developmental childhood trauma. I do speak of them throughout the presentation, with their permission and with anonymity, as they have different last names than I do. So I want to talk about the children in the child welfare system. So like I said, there are 4,000 on August 3rd, 2018. There were 437,283 children in the United States in the child welfare system. 46% lived in foster home placements, 32% lived in kinship placements, 4% in group home placements, 6% in institutional placements, 4% in pre-adoptive, 5% in trial home placements, and 2% in pre-independent. The average age was 9.8 years. The race breakdown was 54% people of color with 44% white, and multiple placements were 65%. The thing that's interesting about the multiple placements, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute, was that the reason for the multiple placements had to do with, and by multiple placements, I don't mean just the first placement the student from the parent's home to a placement. I'm talking about moving from a placement, a foster placement, to another foster placement. So the multiple placements, which have definitely affected the permanency outcomes of these kids, academic difficulties, as well as struggles to develop meaningful attachments. That is huge for these kids because permanency builds trust and well-being for the children. So children that move have a tendency to have behavioral issues. Even if they did not have behavioral issues in their first move, they develop them after that. It is really hard to trust adults if you're in a situation where adults keep moving you to a different placement. So the children's behavior challenges is usually cited amongst the main reasons for placement disruption from their initial foster placement, as well as continual placements. If there was not behavioral issues in the first move, it is usually increases with every eventual move. Behavioral challenges, which are likely due to original trauma, are just compounded by the loss of the biological family. Because remember, they're not just losing their parents, they're losing siblings, they're losing extended family members, and many times they are losing their community that they were a part of. And that traumatic response increases with each move, causing more difficult behaviors, academic challenges, and relationships. So the impact on academics: with each residential move comes the possibility of a school placement change. And that is causing a loss of community, like I said, attachment and continuity of learning. When my daughter Kendra, our oldest, came to us. She was entering the 4th grade. It was the first time she had ever completed a grade within the same school. And she had started doing Head Start. So there were continuous moves for her. It was actually unusual and caused some difficulties for her to stay in the same school and then to go on to 5th grade because of this. It caused Kendra to have a lot of learning delays, not necessarily learning disabilities, but with each move, a child is known to regress 3 to 6 months. And that actually carried out very much for Kendra, I'm sorry. Anna's my youngest daughter. And I have lost my mouse, there it is. So we will get to that for 1 second. So with each school placement, the regression is 3 to 6 months of academics. So imagine what happens many times for students. There are multiple placements that happen for students taken into the child welfare system. The first one may be an emergency removal, where they are taken and placed someplace for overnight for a bed to sleep in. They're then picked up first thing in the morning by the social worker and taken to someplace else that they will be placed. For my daughters, they were removed from their biological family and taken and placed in a kinship placement with their grandmother. That placement lasted for 6 months because of the grandmother's situation. It was not, the grandmother had an alcohol problem as well as was illiterate. She did not speak English, nor could she even read or write in Portuguese. So it made it very difficult to communicate with the school, and the girls were showing up to school unbathed and in unhealthy situations. So they were then removed from the grandmother. They were placed in a foster placement with that had a total of 10 kids. The girls were fortunate that they were always kept together in their groups, which is not necessarily always the case. They were moved to a foster placement that was just overwhelmed. The foster mother did not have the capacity to be able to handle all of those children. That lasted another 6 months before they were then moved to another placement. Each of these placements caused a change in their school placement. They were then placed with a relative, a kinship placement on the other side of the family. That one did last longer, about 1.5 years. Unfortunately, during that time, their trauma just consistently got worse. They were allowed to be unsupervised around their mother, which was against the rules of DCF. And some traumatic experiences occurred with that. They then were returned to DCF by the foster parent, returned the girls as she was not capable of taking care of them. At that point, they were placed in a bridge home, and the trajectory was for pre-adoptive. They lived in a bridge home for 6 months until they were placed with us. And I will just say, in the placement of them coming and living with us, they were placed on July 13th. We met them on July 13th. They were placed in our house on August 22nd. That will give you a time frame for how quickly these placements happen and how little time there is to develop relationships with these kids before permanent situations are established. But I will say 14, 15 years later, we got stuck, and my girls are wonderful and I wouldn't change a thing. But you'll see how that relationship has definitely ended up with a trajectory of academic loss for them. Both of them were placed when they came to us with a fabulous team who established an IEP for them right away. Anna has learning disability and Kendra had learning loss, as well as a social emotional IEP. So I want to talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act. I'm not going to talk about the whole thing because it's quite a long document. But in terms of children in the child welfare system and the things that you need to know about it, it's the reauthorization of the federal law of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2002. It reauthorizes it. As far as kids in the child welfare system, it ensures school stability for youth in foster care, including assurances that the children will enrolled or remain in their school of origin unless the determination is otherwise. So what that is meaning is that if the student is enrolled in Kennedy Elementary School when they are removed from their parents' custody, if at all possible, they are supposed to remain in that school so that they don't lose their community and their academics as well as their biological family. If it has been determined that that's not in their best interest, if the school was looking at placing them elsewhere before they were taken into custody, then we would be looking at another placement. But we want to try and keep them, if we can, where their community is, where their fellow students are. Children in foster care must be enrolled immediately in a new school if they are moved. So if they, I'll use Massachusetts for example, if they are placed in Boston, if they are living in Boston when they are removed, and they are placed someplace more than an hour by transportation, they would have to move the school placement as well, which is unfortunate, but it does happen. So they would place them in a new school district. The Boston School District would be their fiscally responsible LEA, and the new school district would become the programmatic school district, or LEA. So the children would be enrolled immediately in the new school, even if they could not prove documentation or IEPs to be able to prove that that student needs to be enrolled because of their status in the foster system. And that is something that in our state, it is the Department of Children and Family Social Workers' responsibility to enroll them in their new school. And the enrollment must be within 24 hours of the school student being placed in a new placement. It ensures that the transportation be arranged, continued, and funded for the duration of the child's time in foster care. The payment of that is between the foster care system and the school district. So it is not something that the children need to worry about. It is simply that they will be taken care of. It also ensures the collaboration between state agencies, and state employees, that they are working together in the best interest of the student. So we want to make sure that everybody is working in the best interest of the student and not for the facility or agency that they work for. That it's not about the school district and the money. It is not about the Department of Children and Family and their money. It is also requires that each district have a point of contact so that students have representatives or parents, or surrogate parents in our case, have some place to go to when they have questions or issues, so that the children's best interest can be met. So do we have any questions based off of that portion? I'll ask either Karen or Nicole if there are any.
There's no questions.
Okay. All right, so we will move on. And do feel free to, any clarifying questions you have at the time or anything that comes up, some comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to place them in the chat. So let's talk about the development of childhood trauma on the school experience for children in the child welfare system. And in this part, we're going to talk about the impact of learning, compassion and accountability. We'll go over that again, and talk about behavior as a form of communication. So this is the response of trauma on development and learning based on age, and the development based on what should be happening for children at certain periods of their life. This is actually a product put together by the University of Massachusetts Memorial Children's Medical Center. So infants and toddlers, preschoolers, should be working on their working memory. They have, but unfortunately, these kids have difficulty acquiring those developmental milestones. And their control issues around frequent severe meltdowns, aggressive behaviors, and attachment. Again, these children, as we talked about in the first training, particularly for infants and children, that oxycodone actually is stops producing for children who are removed from their biological family, particularly at an early age, particularly removed from their mother. They're not producing it. And one of the situations that affects is the attachment. They don't have the ability to be able to attach appropriately. So they also get easily frustrated, and you'll see that with those severe and frequent meltdowns. And we're not just talking about temper tantrums, we're really talking about children that have complete meltdowns that can last for hours, many times followed by them falling asleep and not remembering exactly what happened. They have no memory of what they said or what they did. It's not uncommon. So for school-age children, they have difficulty with the acquisition for their age period. So they'll be behind in school, particularly as far as their working memory is concerned. Frequently challenging behaviors and outbursts and disruptions in class. And that can be everything from not raising their hand and yelling out answers to instigating a problem with one of their peers. It plays out in many different ways, and sometimes it actually looks like ADHD or learning problems. And so you might find that children who have a trauma background, have these behaviors, may actually be diagnosed with ADHD or learning problems, when in fact, a thorough history of their background may show that they have a trauma background, which would make it very hard to be able to diagnose a student. And particularly if a student has higher levels of cortisol in their system, the last thing that you'd want to do is to be dealing with them with medication as a stimulant. It would actually exacerbate the situation. And so for high school students or young adults, they have trouble keeping up with academics, keeping their schoolwork and their homework organized. So definitely executive functioning is affected. They have difficulty trying to figure out if they have a book report that is due in 3 weeks, how many pages a night do they have to read in order to get the book finished, in order to have time to write a report, edit the report, and hand it in on time. These are also kids that may even be able to get all that done, but don't even put their name on the paper to be able to hand it in and get credit for it. So not surprising that things are very disruptive. They come from very disruptive situations, very chaotic situations, and sometimes that is their comfort level. So home life may be disorganized, but school life certainly is. They're impulsive in their actions, their risky behaviors, maybe even risky behaviors when they're younger. Remember, these are kids that don't have a good sense of self, as we talked about. So a lot of times they may find that they don't have a sense of what's happening around them. So these are also the kids when they're younger that will just run out in front of traffic. So risky behaviors in terms of that, not just risky behaviors in terms of driving fast or things like that. But a lot of times these are actions where they are impulsive, and these are, they have not thought through the consequences. We're going to talk about consequences in discipline. Those are not, punitive discipline is not effective for these students. So they may, in fact, have an involvement with law enforcement. They have a difficulty assuming tasks of what we consider age-appropriate tasks for them, which require a more rapid interpretation of information in order to make decisions about things that we expect young adults to be able to do. As I mentioned in the first training, it is the adolescent brain does not finish developing until approximately the early 30s, which was great because my kids use that as an excuse. When I say, why do you do that? They say, because my brain hasn't finished developing yet. So unfortunately, they spent too much time with their therapists and learned some great language to argue with me about. So let's talk about impaired language skills. Many students have communication issues. We're not necessarily talking about articulation issues. Many times we're talking about social pragmatic skills, the inability to be able to hold down conversations, have conversations with peers, that they don't know how to volley in a conversation. So one student says, I like baseball, and the other student doesn't know how to pick up that subject and carry on a conversation. So social pragmatics is something for these students, particularly since they haven't had a chance to be able to develop relationships, as well as they may not have had the ability when they were infants to have a reciprocal relationship in learning to communicate. How often do you see someone who sees a baby and goes up and smiles and goes goo goo gaga, and the baby responds in the same way? We actually have mirroring neurons. So that's how babies learn things, is by mimicking what we are doing. But if a child doesn't have anyone to mimic from, you're going to have problems with these social pragmatic things. You're going to have problems with nonverbal learning issues because they don't have a sense of body language and how to pick up and read social cues from other people. Partly they were not introduced to this in the appropriate time, and part of it is they have, particularly for kids who are living in congregate care facilities, don't necessarily have that modeling that they should have as they are growing up. Difficulty with pragmatic languages, sarcasm. I have a very sarcastic sense of humor, and unfortunately that did not go well for my kids. They never understood whether I was joking or telling the truth. They still don't get it to this day, so not surprising. They have an inability to connect words with their experiences. So a lot of that goes back to the earlier times when trauma happened. They did not have a language often to be able to put experiences with that language. They didn't know how to talk about it. So they also don't have the skills or the language to be able to talk about feelings or relationships, emotions, I mean, and that really affects relationships. When you get to a point that you have to start to talk more about things instead of acting on things, that really changes things. And I saw that happen a lot with Anna when she turned about 4th to 5th grade. The girls started to have experiences where they at recess, where they all got together and they talked and they shared stories and things like that. Ani didn't have those skills to do that. So she has always been somebody who has more male friends than she does female friends, because she's more of a physical kid. She acts and does physical things where you don't have to talk as much with someone else, because she still to this day does not have strong social pragmatic skills. So difficulty organizing material. I laugh that these are my kids cleaning out their locker at the end of the year. They used to come with shopping bags, 5 shopping bags to empty out their locker. And I was always surprised because who can get 5 shopping bags out of a locker? But actually for them, because they couldn't keep things organized, they had a locker on every floor of their high school, so that they didn't have to worry about if their history class was on the 3rd floor, where was their history book? They just kept it in the 3rd floor locker. So actually had developed some adaptive skills, maybe not the most adaptive skills they could have, but it worked for them at the time. So difficulty organizing school and personal materials. This is definitely something that a binder check, someone going over and helping them with organizing their material would definitely play out well on their IEP. Deficits in creating routine and timelines. They need to have someone work through with them with rubrics and organizers, graphic organizers, to figure out exactly when they need to do things by. And because they don't have, or they have a compromised goal setting, they don't have an internal motivation for being able to do things in short-term, long-term planning or in the future. One of the situations that plays out is they don't see the value in doing something that will play out 2 or 3 weeks from now. So if you want them to study every night because that's the better way to study, that doesn't play out well, because they don't understand if I study every single night for 3 weeks for a test that's coming up, I can then do well in this class. If I do well in this class, I will do well in high school. If I do well in high school, I can get into a good college. If I do well in college, I can get a good job and possibly get that Maserati that I've always been thinking I'm going to get. And they don't have the ability to think in that sense. They have a foreshortened sense of future, and they don't have the ability to go through and plan like that. So it definitely, you can see this in sometimes the smallest of things. And we talked earlier about in our first training what happens with students that have trauma experiences, that when they are stressed or going through a stressful situation, their cognition shuts down. And that actually played out. Anna called me one night on a Sunday night from college and said to me, the Wi-Fi has gone down at the college. Wi-Fi has gone down. It was 10:30 on a Sunday night, and she had a paper due at midnight. I did not even start the conversation of why are you waiting until midnight, but she did not have the ability to set out and plan, nor did she have the ability to think about how to respond to the situation and make changes that she needed to make immediately. So a very quick response of hotspot from your phone to your computer, you'll have Wi-Fi and you can go ahead and do the work. It was a very simple response, but it was not something that she had the ability to be able to do that. Then afterwards, we talked about the goal setting and being able to plan out much better. But having academic supports is definitely huge for these kids. Delayed cause and effect. They have an inability or an inhibited development of an ability to set goals and delayed gratification. It's hard for them to be able to put off something that they feel that they need right now. So that definitely plays out self-incentive or persistence in achieving academic success for non-preferred activities. You can see this all the time in students in classrooms, regardless of age. They don't understand why they should do the work that they should do because they don't have that internal drive or incentive to be able to do that. and they don't learn from negative consequences. Many times those negative consequences play out for these students as another loss. And for kids that have lost everything, it doesn't have the effect that you would like it to have. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Difficulty in taking other people's perspective. They don't have a sense of their own perspective, that lack of sense of self. So it is difficult for them to be able to take perspective on what is happening with somebody else. So particularly in the temporal lobe area is usually underdeveloped for children with trauma. That is where the empathy and remorse sections of your brain are developed. And if those neural connections are not there, there's just a limited capacity to be able to understand that. I do say that in certain times, certain situations, I do find that students who have trauma backgrounds can be very understanding of people more vulnerable than they are, particularly younger kids or animals. We were never able to get through a Disney film without Anna having a meltdown about worrying about what was going to happen to the character, be it an animal, a child, or whatever. But also a limited ability to make independent choices. So there definitely can be followers, which makes them vulnerable populations to being re-traumatized, re-victimized, as well as bullied. So bullying is, at least in Massachusetts, bullying conversation is part of an IEP discussion. So we want to take a look at whether the child is a possible victim of bullying or would be a bullier themselves. And that is one of the concerns that one can have when they don't have the ability to take somebody else's perspective. Inattentiveness in classroom tasks, the anxiety that they experience and that fear that is created because of the hypervigilance, that the thought that there is a perceived threat happening makes it hard to pay attention to what's happening in class if you're always worried about what might happen. It is very distracting. They have a lack of ability to focus because of that. And sometimes the sensory input might be ignored if not interpreted as traumatic. Many times in classrooms, and teachers try really hard to make the classrooms look attractive. Sometimes that sensory input is just too much for them to be able to take. So a lot of kids with trauma backgrounds have sensory issues. OT evals would actually play out well, assessments to be able to see what their sensory input is. It could be noises in the classroom, it could be too loud, it could be too bright, it could be too many things going on that could add to things for them. ADHD and trauma may coexist, but many times it's misdiagnosed because it does look like trauma. It does look like ADHD. Also, many times there are situations where someone may confuse a kid with severe trauma as having autism. Many of the students in the Romanian orphanages in the early years 2000 were found to be thought to have autism because of the repetitive stymieing behavior that they did in self-soothing. But it is not the case for most of them. So there's many times there's misdiagnosis, and a lot of that goes back to the history that we talked about with ACEs and what has happened to the children. Also, hard to be attentive in class if one is tired. I think we all feel that, particularly in this day and age with a lot of Zoom meetings, things like that. The chronic fatigue the symptom may look like chronic fatigue due to the cortisol imbalance. Remember, they have much higher levels of cortisol, which affect their sleep cycle. So these kids don't sleep regularly on a regular pattern as they should. They have trouble falling asleep. They have trouble staying asleep. And that may, in fact, cause these kids to be the kids who have to put their head down on the desk in class. So it may look like they're not paying attention. It's not that they're willfully doing that. It's the fact that they don't have the ability to do that, to stay awake for that. We talked about executive functioning, the difficulty initiating and carrying out plans, particularly if they have trouble making plans. So they have a tendency to act out as opposed to thinking things through. So they do things on impulse. They have very black and white thinking with no gray areas, very poor abstract reasoning to be able to figure out things dialectically, that two things can be true even though they seem to be opposite. And so they have a tendency to make decisions with negative consequences, because remember, they're not looking at the sense of future, so they don't see that this consequence may lead to a negative response. The lack of engagement in the curriculum. They, like we said before, they have trouble mastering tasks just for the sake of competency. Difficulty establishing good study skills based off of what we've talked about previously. Avoiding challenging tasks due to the fear of failure. This is actually common. We hear that a lot from our surrogate parents, that the kids don't want to try to do something, particularly doing something like reading in front of the classroom, if they have difficulty reading. It's embarrassing to them, and they're not going to try to do something that they think they're going to fail, because they already have a low self-esteem. And they definitely perceive their future as being not being promising, because they haven't had that modeled for them for the most part, for the children in the DCF system. So trouble regulating the emotions. We talked earlier about fight, flight, flock, freeze, or fawn. These are the responses to not being able to regulate emotions. They have a misperception of ordinary sensory information due to that hypervigilance. So many times they will overreact to things. They will be standing in line, and how often has a child stood in line waiting to transition from the classroom, say, to the cafeteria, and gets bumped by another student, and their response is out of proportion. They're like, Johnny hit me. Well, he didn't actually hit you, he bumped you, and it was an accident. But they don't have the ability to be able to regulate that, so that response is disproportionate to what had happened. Or for other students, many times they are restricted in their feelings and dampening. So it can lead either to an explosion. That was Anna. She is an exploder, and everything comes out when she has a strong reaction. And Kendra is an imploder, where she becomes very quiet and internalizes things, and is a self-sabotager. Anytime she would do something well and get praised for it, she would turn around and sabotage it to try and prove to us the fact that she, in fact, was not the good person that we thought she was. So I'd like to have you take a moment and just think about this question. Unfortunately, we could not do breakout rooms, which I was hoping to do. So I'm going to ask you to do this for yourself. Is think about at least one specific goal based on the information we have covered that might be appropriate for B for a student with trauma background, and one benchmark that would be effective for a student. And if you would type those into the chat, that would be great. And then we'll kind of scroll through and pick out a couple of them to read. So I want to talk about behavior. and understanding that the behaviors. It really is working with kids in the child welfare system. It's so important to start to understand their behavior. We discuss the trauma so that you have an understanding of the fact that trauma leads to underdeveloped skills. And as Ross Green says, kids will do well if they can, and many times behaviors are the result of underdeveloped skills. So every challenging behavior is a form of communication. So what are the kids trying to communicate? And that sometimes is something that is challenging even for them to be able to understand. It is simply something that they have to understand themselves. So I do want to talk a little bit about discipline. Punitive discipline does not work for these kids, particularly because the behaviors are not something that they're doing on purpose. It are behaviors because they're trying to communicate something to us. So learning to change their skill or develop a skill through punitive action does not necessarily work. One of the best things that works for kids with trauma is restorative justice. So I'd like to actually show you a video, a short video about restorative justice, and which is self-explanatory. Then we can talk about that for a second. Oops, sorry about that.
So come on in, everyone. Take a seat. So welcome to Circle. We have a few guidelines to keep us going. So what we're doing today is a community building circle. It is a tier 1 practice in restorative justice. We do tier 1 circles to build community, to connect with each other, to practice speaking and listening in a different way. Say their name, say their name. Okay, what does the word say? Go ahead, what does that mean to you?
What I saw was missing is 100% of your community feeling part of the community. And many high schools, including this one, I think there was a group of people who feel like they were the community, and then everyone else was kind of left out.
My name is Jordan. On a scale from 1 to 10, I'm feeling like a 10.
How are you feeling from 0 to 10?
Restorative justice, we just come to a place where we hear every person's side of the story. Before I knew about RJ, I was a tough girl, like always fighting, getting into conflict. Like I was the one always fighting, going to the office, getting reflections, getting suspended. And then now, like, I see where other people come from, and I'd be like, okay, well, don't do this. You know, you can do this another way.
In Oakland Unified, we use a 3-tier system. So tier 1 are the practices that pretty much everybody should be doing all the time. It's relationships, that's the glue that holds us together. And when things break down, we do tier 2. So it's a triangle. Tier 2, there are fewer interventions. Ideally, there are fewer interventions. Those would be mediations, harm circles, conflict circles. And then tier 3 at the top of the pyramid, ideally should be the fewest that we do, but that's when a student has had to be removed, and we reintegrate them through a welcome and reentry process. And what I want to ask you is to share a time when you feel like your voice wasn't heard. Can you use your voice as a young person in Oakland? Go ahead.
Me personally, I feel like youth, we can't do anything about it. For example, like voting, like we didn't want Trump, but like we couldn't do anything about it because we can't vote because we're not old enough.
One time, I felt like my voice wasn't being heard because I was like really little, and these people had like robbed the store or whatever, and I saw the whole thing, but the people that was like doing the robbery wasn't paying attention to me because I was like a little girl. So I tried to tell people what happened, and they didn't listen to me.
This room just to sit in here is quiet, so it's like a peaceful space. Outside of school is not like that for everybody.
My name is Monica, and I'm feeling like a 6.
What restorative justice provides that traditional school discipline methods do not is the chance for people to take responsibility and understand the impact of their actions on others. It's internally driven. It has to be because I understand that there was something that I did that broke a bond here, and that this breakage is connected to other breakages that make all of us as a community weaker. The expectation of people to take responsibility for their actions is the way forward. I mean, that's the magic. That's the revolution that needs to happen.
I appreciate him for being I appreciate Spencer because he always in a good mood every day.
When I did the grief circle, I needed to talk to somebody. Because my mom passed away my 9th grade year when I was here. So all that weight that was on me, I told them that at the end, I finally cried. I let everything go. And that's what the best thing was. That was the best thing that happened in like 2-3 years.
Yeah, we're being good friends.
Was your friend of playing basketball?
For it to be this space, which is school, yes, that's powerful. That's powerful.
Community just doesn't happen because you put people together and they're in one building. It happens because we talk, because we listen, because we worry about each other, we care about each other. When they are in conflict, they need help. They don't need us to just push them out. They need us to bring them in.
I appreciate my dad for listening.
There's a wider understanding from the school community that RJ can be used preventatively.
He's just a cool person to be with. Yes.
He has a good personality and a very bright sense of humor.
As a tool for community building and a tool for learning. Okay, thank you everyone. We'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. So it's not just to deal with behavior issues. It precedes that as well. It precedes it, it's after it, and it's all around it. And that's the whole point, is that when we find that we have more in common with each other than not, we'll be able to get along, we'll be able to learn, we'll be more peaceful and equitable with each other.
So restorative justice, one of the key things that's helpful for kids in the child welfare system is that creation of community that they don't necessarily have in their living situation. They don't necessarily, a lot of kids are coming and going when they live in congregate care. They make multiple moves. So that sense of community may be something that's established only in the school's system for them. I'm actually going to skip this question in light of time. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. I would ask that you actually hold them to the end just because I'm conscious of time. But because I definitely want to get to resilience. Resilience is the key for these kids. And one of the common factors about resilience that studies have proven is that having at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult can help a student build resilience. That's one of the reasons why restorative justice works, because of the adults involved in it. There are kids that seem to be more resilient than others. They've just developed the skills earlier. So it's the ability to bounce back from challenging situations, and that is something that we need to help the kids in child welfare system to be able to do, because they are facing huge challenges every single day. So I'd like to quickly show you this video on resilience.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
So that understanding and nurturing relationship from a trusted adult can really heal for these kids. And many times that is someone found in the school system. It is that teacher. I think if we all take a minute and think back about the teacher who made a difference in our lives, we can see the shift that has happened. We do a lot of training with teachers and teaching them to work with the islands of competency, making sure that on the IEP, the team is looking at what is the student good at, not just in academics, but as a whole person, that they're encouraging them to, encouraging the team to bring up what is good about, is this person a good friend? Are they good at things in the community? What are they good at on that island of competency, and build off of those natural talents that they have, so that in fact the student just feels better about themselves, which will in turn start to grow. And as we talked just earlier about belonging to a community, if they have a sense of belonging to a community, they also have a sense of accountability to that community. So you'll find that behaviors start to decrease when they have a sense of, oh, I'm affecting my decision or my actions affect other people. When they affect other people, it's going to affect them in this way. These are the 6 cores of healthy development, attachment being the first one, and you get that through those relationships. Self-regulation, learning to control the impulses. Affiliation, being part of that group again. Attunement, being aware of what's happening with others. And tolerance, accepting differences, and respect of finding value in the differences. This is a teacher, this is one of my favorite videos, is a teacher who has learned to establish relationships with his students in a very simple, easy way of doing that.
I've been rolling in, watching school footage across the road. In this room, is everybody here? This is period. Like now, what do you mean? I was just like the lights down right here. Is this great to see you? Thank you. Thank you very much. You ready, Chef? I don't know if you're ready. You ready? All right, what you got? Yeah, me too.
I can't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday, let alone being able to remember every single handshake. Incredible teacher, and the way he bonded with each of those students has just set the tone for the day. It's created a sense of community and setting the tone for the rest of the day. I am going to move on to some strategies. So in the first part of the training, we had to take a look at what your ACEs were, your adverse childhood experiences. It's important to know what your own levels of reactivity are. I wish before having kids that I had, kids with trauma histories, that I knew what my own ACEs were. I would have probably responded a little bit differently, understanding that I was being triggered by their expressions, not that they were not that what they were doing was disrespectful or whatever. I wouldn't have taken things so personally. So I think as individuals, if we can ask ourselves what happened to this child instead of what's wrong with this child, I think it will shift things. Sorry, there's a cat in the camera. I think it will definitely shift things for how we look at children in the child welfare system. These are things that happen to them, not things that they asked for, and not things that they had much control over. If you could help educate yourself and become more trauma sensitive and trauma informed, it helps working with families that are currently going through trauma or children who've experienced trauma. Suggesting to parents that they make sure that the evaluations done by schools are trauma informed, so that they're looking at things through that trauma lens, and that community providers, including therapists and adjustment counselors, teachers, are also trauma informed would be helpful. We are not doing breakout rooms. I do want to talk for a quick second about vicarious trauma. Or secondary trauma that you take on, trauma from working with people who are traumatized, by taking on their trauma so that it becomes yours. That is something that I think is very key right now with teachers, of working with kids who have been traumatized through the pandemic. And not being part of the community by having to do remote learning. But it definitely is something that impacts people working with kids in the child welfare system, because it is hard to hear the stories every day and not have it impact you. As I said in the beginning of this training, and the beginning of the other training, it's kind of like the oxygen mask on an airplane. You're asked to put yours on first so that you're able to help somebody else. So take a look at what your possibility of vicarious trauma may be. What is your self-care thing that you have? It may only be one, but what do you do for yourself for self-care? And when you can't answer that question, it's usually an indicator that there is some vicarious trauma going on, and that you might need to take a look at what it is that you could do. And it may not be sitting down doing yoga or meditating for an hour. It may be, you're a person who comes home from work, changes clothes, gets into comfies, and maybe it's taking a bath before doing that. Maybe it's spending 10 minutes relaxing with the family at the dinner table before you get up to clear. Anything that you can do that takes care of yourself and puts yourself first will make it easier for you to be able to be there to help others. So it's not our job to toughen our children up to face a cruel and heartless world. It's our job to raise children who will make the world a little less cruel and heartless. So I thank you all for being part of today's training. This is my contact information. As I said before, you can contact me if you have any questions that we did not answer. If you have anything you'd like to share and discuss, I do have people's emails and can get things out to you. So thank you again. Take some time, please, to fill out the evaluation that that is in the session feedback. I know it's very important to everyone at the conference that you fill that out. So I appreciate your time today and have a great day.